Sudan Minister Naledi Pandor has made the government's stance on Russia very clear. Missiles or not, they stand united. She clarified this yesterday while hosting Russia's Minister of Natural Resources and Environment, that's Alexander Kozlov, while also emphasizing that Russia is, I quote, an old friend. Let's unpack this with international relations expert Thembisa Fakude. But before we speak to Mr. Fakude, here's what the minister had to say.
You would see, Minister, that there's a great deal of media interest in our meeting because there are some who don't wish us to have relations with an old historical friend. We have made it clear that Russia is a friend, and we've had cooperative partnerships for many, many years, including partnerships as we combated the apartheid regime, which decimated our people and our country. And while we are friends with many all over the world, we cannot become sudden enemies at the demand of others.
Mr. Fakude, good morning. Thank you very much for your time. One would say it doesn't get much clearer than that. Basically, the minister is saying South Africa will not renounce its friendship with Russia at the behest of any other friend. Your views on that statement?
It's interesting. I think sometimes the minister gets carried away. I don't think there's anyone who's questioning the relationship, nor asking for Russia for South Africa to cancel its relationship with Russia. By the way, South Africa had a strong relationship with USSR, which Russia is or was part of. And many South African activists were actually exiled in Ukraine, in Kyiv. So that statement was made in the backdrop of what's going on in Ukraine. So I don't think anyone is questioning that. But what most people are questioning, they're questioning South Africa's ambivalent position when it comes to condemning Russia for its atrocities, particularly in Ukraine.
Now, this dualist position or fence-sitting of ours was tested back in 2015 with the arrival of Omar al-Bashir. So our obligations to the AU against the ICC there were up for consideration, and it seems the country chose the AU. Again, we find ourselves in that position, or government finds itself in that position, where their obligations to the ICC will now have to be weighed against their obligations to the BRICS community. This type of a situation surely cannot continue, and now we have Mandla Mandela saying perhaps they need to attempt to withdraw again. Where do you stand on this? Can South Africa afford to disregard a warrant of arrest?
Well, South Africa is a promoter of multilateralism, and people such as Chief Mandela, of course, they're being emotional. We had no gun in our heads when we went and ratified the Rome Statutes. In 2022, December, during the ANC conference, the ANC re-emphasized its position after it threatened, that is, the government threatened to pull out of the ICC in 2016. The ANC conference rescinded that decision. So it was the ANC once again that wanted to locate itself within the ICC. And I think we need to avoid the embarrassment that we found ourselves when Hassan Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, visited this country. We have to act correctly this time around, and we're expected to arrest Vladimir Putin when it comes for crimes against humanity. Thousands of kids that have been abducted in Ukraine. We see wanton destruction of infrastructure in Ukraine, killing of women and children, and displacement of thousands of people. It's not the Ukrainians that are currently in Russia, but it is Russia that is in Ukraine.
I want to talk about that analogy of friendship. One would believe that the seriousness of the matter has been elevated. It's no longer just a friend asking a friend to snub the other. It's the International Criminal Court issuing a warrant for the arrest of Putin. Just that analogy alone, some have found it disingenuous, like you also stated, that it's not about friendship. You can keep your friendship, but if nothing else, one would assume that a friend is the one that would easily be able to nudge their friend and say, perhaps you need to look at this differently.
Well, South Africa is actually caught between a rock and a hard place. And again, the friendship that South Africa has with Russia has endured way, some people have said, past the sell-by date. And again, you know, what do South Africa feel about this relationship? How is it beneficial to South Africans outside politics? Can you really afford to continue having friends such as Russia, notwithstanding these obvious violations that we see continue happening? So it's something that has to be interrogated. And I think it's misplaced to continue thinking that the large part of South Africans, they really do still believe that we must sustain this relationship with Russia, which, by the way, is benefiting only the political. But economically, we can't afford to find ourselves entrenched deeply into standing.
But Mr. Fakude, how do we genuinely gauge this? How do you gauge the sentiment on the ground? Because if we just went on social media, they are split down the middle. There are those who are in support of the relationship continuing and those who aren't. So how does government gauge where South Africans actually stand on this matter?
I think I'm getting a problem with my son, but I think you're referring to how the South African government gauges the relationship with the outside world.
Not its apologies there. No, it's not its relationship. I'm sorry for interjecting. Not necessarily its relationship, but how does it gauge citizens' position on the matter? Because you're saying a great number of South Africans actually don't care for the relationship with Russia. But I'm saying, how do we honestly gauge that? Because it seems with just social media, they split down the middle. There are those who feel strongly that the West is the aggressor in this matter. They shouldn't have expanded westwards. That's NATO, breaking the Warsaw Pact. And then there are those that say this is a humanitarian crisis and the government needs to call out Russia. So how does government gauge where exactly citizens stand? The majority of them, that is.
Well, it's difficult to gauge. Of course, you can only look at what the other public platforms and the media says, but there's enough commentary at the moment in South Africa which has been questioning our relationship with Russia, particularly after its invasion of Ukraine. So it's a difficult one. But again, we also need to look at to which side is the economic relations tilting. Yes, the political and historical relationship that we have with Russia is important, but it's also important for us to look at the current relationships, particularly economic relations that we enjoy with other countries. And what are those countries saying regarding the current standoff in Ukraine? What are our allies saying? Those allies that we depend on, by and large, in terms of our economic survival in South Africa, what are they saying about the standoff in Russia? And no one, again, is calling for South Africa to suspend or cancel its relations with Russia, but we need to be balanced and stand firm, one, in terms of promotion of multilateralism, but also the position that South Africa has had since the tenure of President Nelson Mandela, that of standing firm for justice, that of standing firm for human rights around the world.
But then now, what does the decision, the visit last week of China actually say to South Africa? Because they're all members of BRICS, and it was almost, some thought, would embolden South Africa to say China is snubbing all of this. It's continuing and strengthening its relationships and even its global profile as a diplomat or what we would call a broker in this instance, that a peace broker on the world stage. So in that instance, when you have a China that snubs everything else that's going on, where would a South Africa stand on the matter? Because they are yet to meet for the BRICS summit.
Yeah, once again, I'm struggling with the sound, but I think you're talking about China and BRICS. I'm not quite sure whether I'm in the right spot. My network is not the best. But I think, again, South Africa finds itself in a much more complicated position as it struggles with navigating this relationship. China, for example, one of the most important investors at the moment in Africa, continues to be very aggressive when it comes to investing in Africa. But as I've said earlier before, that South Africa is also addicted to a lot of European and American products, and it has to really consider itself when it comes to relations. We can't just blindly align ourselves with certain foreign policy, notwithstanding that our economic policy is reliant elsewhere.
All right. Mr. Fakude, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's international relations expert Thembisa Fakude. We do apologize for that audio. Hope you were able to get at least the gist of what Mr. Fakude was saying. More news saying, rather.